Good evening, everyone. This is Professor Hill. This is a short video for our class, Introduction to Ethics Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College. This is the summer one term for the class, and this is week 4 of our 5-week intensive summer class. Today's Tuesday, the 29th of June, and we had an assignment that was due last Sunday. We have one coming up this Thursday. And then Sunday night. So we have Thursday and Sunday night. Those are the last 2 essays for the class. And then next week, which is the last week, week 5, the final exam is due, and that'll be due Thursday night. So this class comes to an end next Thursday. So we got a case study we're looking at for this Thursday. And we've been dealing with international humanitarian law. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in this short video. The information, the materials that you need are in the module marked week 4, International Humanitarian Law. It's nothing from the textbook this week for our assignment, because again, we had this introduction of this kind of interesting case study with Calvin Graham last Sunday night, and the introduction about child soldiers. And now we're looking at a case involving Baha Musa. And it's a difficult case study because it's complex and there's a lot of factors, especially when you look at the role of the doctor, both that it's clear he should have done more, and yet there's also mitigating factors like his age and inexperience and the lack of clarity around expectations and his role. But when you look at what's the appropriate sanction for him, what's the appropriate punishment, it's tricky. He's obviously got not as much culpability as the actual soldiers that did the torturing of Baha Musa, and yet he does have some responsibility. And so we have to decide how things turned out in the end. Do we think that was a just outcome in this particular case? But we also need to understand a little bit about the history of the sources of authority for looking at cases like this. And as I mentioned in my announcement a couple days ago, sources of authority are just the bodies of rules and principles that guide us and tell us what to do and not do in given circumstances and situations. And so they can be everything from the laws of a city or state or country. They could be rules that govern people in the military, like the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They could be religious rules, like just the 10 Commandments or Roman Catholic canon law. These are all different sources of authority that govern us and guide us. Some obligatory on us as citizens, some we kind of volunteer for with the religions that we become members of and bind ourselves through our participation in those religions. But when we look at sources of authority, one of which is going to be international humanitarian law. And it is a set of rules and principles that bind the conduct of armed conflict. These are typically like the Geneva Convention. It's a whole body of law, but the Geneva Convention is something lots of people are familiar with in terms of the rules of warfare. This is you have to treat the prisoners with some humanity. You can't bomb hospitals, or you can't kill civilians. These are the rules that govern modern combat. But they have an interesting and old tradition I want to talk a little bit about tonight. And so let me start our, I'm going to share a screen here. This is our PowerPoint for the evening. And it turns out this is just a little bit about the history of, let's see if we can get rid of that there. The history of the Geneva Conventions. And this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and dealing with, in part because I do teach ethics. I do teach the Geneva Conventions and international military law on the military bases here in San Antonio. I do it for the Red Cross, for example. And I also have had a chance to go to Geneva and study where the Geneva Conventions were written and where they still have a kind of an embodiment of the source of authority for them, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Is the international headquarters is in Geneva. They sponsor training because they have an interesting and unique role in IHL. A lot of people that are familiar with the Red Cross in the United States, the American Red Cross, they're just think of them as kind of an emergency preparation and relief, maybe first aid. But it turns out they have their traditional role. The reason the Red Cross came into existence is about IHL. And the study of it is it's kind of its own unique subset within law. And it goes back to a time before it was codified into formal treaties, into like conventions that we have now. It used to just be an oral tradition. It used to be a custom. And when we look at, for example, where these things began, where do they come out of? It comes out of these battles in Europe 600 years ago. And one of the famous battles that we're still talking about now because of what happened there, in terms of the law of arms, is the Battle of Agincourt. And it turns out that this is the field where this battle took place. And two big important things happen at this battle, which continue to be talked about and shape IHL to this day. But the battle here in this field in France got started when Henry V starts here in England and comes across the Channel and lands at Harfleur. Now, the plan for Henry V was to land there because there's a castle here at the mouth of the Seine River, which goes all the way down to Paris, which is down here. And it turns out that what he was thinking was, I'll land there, capture the castle that, controls the access and mouth of the river there, and then I'll just march down and take Paris. Well, that was a good plan, but the problem is he's also on a clock. 600 years ago, they didn't have, all-weather 24/7, all, year-round warfare. Back in the day, given the limits, you would fight in the spring and summer when you could. You could move troops around. But you get into the wintertime, the weather conditions just made it so that you couldn't fight. You would just essentially pack up, camp out and wait it out until you could get to fighting weather. So what happens is he comes across in early spring and he's thinking, I need to capture Harfleur, the castle there, so that by the summertime I can get down to Paris, wrap all this up before the fall gets here. That's the plan anyway. It doesn't go according to plan. And so what happens, though, is he does come across and he lays siege to the castle there, but it doesn't, it doesn't fall quickly. In fact, they put up a great defense, and it takes him a long time. He does finally capture the castle there at Harfleur, but two things, one of which is he's lost valuable time because he's worried about the weather, and it's given the French time to organize a big response. They put together a big army because they know, oh my gosh, he's landed. They're holding him off there while we get our big army together. And so what you see here along the coastline, this route is not, it's not the plan, which was to march down to Paris. It's, oh no, look, the French army has showed up. And so they start to run down the coastline and then down this river. And now what's happened is this giant French army has accumulated, and they're kind of now just chasing them. And so they come down here, turn around, and start to head back. And as he's retreating literally away from Paris, Henry, he's got a sense of the situation now. And he knows at some point he's going to need to turn and stop and fight. And at least he'll have control of, he'll be able to pick the spot where the battle happens. And so he'll have that on his side. And he's going to need something on his side because the French have mustered this incredibly large army. And they have superior numbers. And this is a big thing. They have heavy cavalry. They have horses. And their troops are fresh. And they're fighting on their own home turf. So, suddenly Henry realizes, this isn't exactly going according to plan. This is looking bad for me. Because I got to tell you, the French do have a lot of heavy armor. They've got knights. They've got even, you can see here this great picture, even the horses are wearing armor. And Henry, because he came across on the ships, he's got a few horses with him, but not a lot. He couldn't bring like giant cavalry, and especially heavily armored cavalry with him, just because he had to get all these things on the old rickety wooden sailing ships. Not so for the French. So they show up with this tremendous advantage, which is they can send in armored cavalrymen on armored horses and just mow down infantrymen. And so that's a giant advantage. And the French have not just twice as many, not just 3 times as many, but they think somewhere between maybe 4 to 5 times as many troops. The numbers aren't exact because, again, it was 600 years ago, but they are massively outgunned and outnumbered. So it turns out, though, Henry does have he ends up with a couple of things on his side. I mentioned that he's backing away, he's retreating, he can at least turn and pick the spot. That's one. Number 2, though, he also has these longbows. The English longbows were famous because the English realized that if they used really sturdy old growth oak trees that grow in England, they could make these long bows where they could get more compression and more distance out of their bows. And that gave them, their archers, a big advantage. Their arrows would go further. And in a fight with archers, that's like having a boxer in a ring who has a longer reach. I can punch you in the face all day if your arms are shorter and you can't fight back. And having that extended range is a big advantage. Now, Henry, he's got the archers. He's been able to pick the location. And then he also gets lucky as 1/3 final thing, which really goes well for him. And that's the weather. It turns out the day he picks the spot, he also gets perfect weather. And what happens is, this is what this looks like. Henry's been retreating kind of down this way, between these 2 big hills. Agincourt city on one side, this big open grassy field we saw at the beginning, and Tramcourt on the other side. So it kind of makes this wedge. And what you see is here, Henry has the French follow him kind of down into this funnel, and then he turns to fight, and he puts his archers up on the hills and behind him. And his thinking is, if the French just pour troops into this funnel, at the end of it, he'll have almost an equal match. He can't be overwhelmed by the French numbers if they have to put them in this constrained area. Hopefully what he can do is fight them on the battlefield and have the archers just rain arrows down on them. That's a pretty good strategy. And so he's got the right location. And again, what happens is he gets lucky. and then he's able to pull into just the right spot at just the right time because it begins to rain, and I mean really rain hard. And so what happens is the battlefield where he's met them, that big grassy field we saw, just turns into a mud pit. And so now the French soldiers in their armor, on their armored horses, rather than that being an advantage, they literally sink into the mud. They can't move around, and they become sitting ducks. Now, all of a sudden, it's the infantry that has the advantage. And of course, the archers have the advantage because they just begin to rain arrows down. And when this battle begins, Henry, dramatically outnumbered, is able to lure the French into this wedge, into this narrow area, and it starts to work. He just starts to get more and more and more of the French troops pour into this trap, and they're able to just kill them and kill them and kill them. So it's going well for him. And so in October of 1415, Henry is fighting this battle, and even though he's really outnumbered because of the terrain, the weather, the longbows, he starts to win this battle. And then two things happen. One is that behind here's Henry's red troops here. Behind them, the night before, they had spent the night in a camp. And behind the lines is this kind of camp where they have like wagons where they had supplies and extra arms and clothes and all the stuff you would have on an expedition like this. And guarding the camp were young boys. These are children, sometimes, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, who were just aides to the officers, aides to the camp. They would do things like cook and take care of the horses and wash clothes. These were non-combatants. They were, children who were kind of learning the life and seeing what it was like and participating, getting some experience, but again, not as fighters, not as combatants. Well, what happens during the course of the battle is the French realize, oh my God, we are actually not winning this, even though we have superior numbers. And they were, I'm sure, dramatically overconfident at the start of this. They begin to realize, oh my God, we are actually losing this battle. And at some point during the course of the battle, the French send a small party, not trying to open up a front, not trying to outflank them and sweep around behind them, but a small group goes all the way around Agincourt, around the hill. And while the battle's going on, they swing around to the back and they attack the camp. And they sack the camp and they burn the wagons. And this is the thing. They go through and they slaughter all the young boys. They kill all the aides. These are unarmed children. Now, maybe they did it in a fit of rage because so many of the French are already been killed on the battlefield. But even then, even in 1415, it was against the rules of combat to kill children like that. It was just seen as a natural principle, some kind of rule or principle that existed that it's a line you wouldn't cross, even in wartime, even in combat, because it was just seen as being shocking to the conscience to do that. And yet the French do this. And then they turn around, they leave, and they ride all the way back around. Like I said, they weren't trying to get some military advantage. They weren't trying to open up a new front or attack them from behind. They just literally attack the camp and then they swing back around. Now, here's the other thing. While this is happening, the battle's going on. And the other thing is the battle, like I said, is going really very badly for the French. And so what happens is a lot of the infantrymen, even a lot of the cavalrymen that are in this battle, they realize how badly it's going and they begin to surrender. And so as French troops start surrendering to Henry V and his Englishmen, they pull them off the battlefield and they get them again behind the lines. If the camp was over here, this field where they take the prisoners, again, they're just pulling them off the battlefield behind the lines. And it's not like there's a camp or anything. They just take them back there. They're disarmed. They bind their hands and they have them sit on the ground and just wait for the battle to be over. That was common practice, that you would exchange prisoners at the end and even buy out noblemen. Noblemen would sometimes even bring money to battle so that at the end of it, if they were captured, they could just buy their way out. Or if they didn't have it on them, you know, contact the relatives would pay and get your captured prisoners back. There would be this exchange at the end of the battle. But for now, they're just literally tied up, sitting in the back, waiting for it to end. Well, news reaches Henry on the battlefield, in the midst of the battle, that the French have attacked the camp, sacked it, and killed all the boys. And he's pretty unhappy. And shortly thereafter, he makes the decision that, look, we're winning this battle because we've got a great strategy and it's working, but it's not over yet. And they're still outnumbered and there's no guarantee they're going to win this battle. So he gives the order that, look, I need all of our troops up here on the line fighting, even the ones that are guarding the prisoners. And the response is, well, look, you know, King, that's great, but the number of prisoners has grown from dozens to hundreds. We've got 600, 700, 800 prisoners back there. And Henry's like, yeah, I know. And it's taken a lot of our men to guard them. And we need those guys up here. Because again, it had gone from a few to a dozen to a couple of dozen soldiers that were needed to guard this crowd of 800 prisoners. And so Henry gives this order and he says, I need everybody up here. And they say, well, what about the prisoners? And he says, kill them all. Just go through and cut all their throats. And then that'll free up our soldiers to come and fight. And they do that. They go through this field of 800 unarmed, bound prisoners and slaughter them. And then they rejoin the fight. Now, was Henry doing that as an act of retribution because the boys had been killed in the camp? Did he really need the men at the line? He later insisted that it was a military decision out of military necessity, and it works. I mean, they do win the day. The French just keep pouring troops and troops and troops into that funnel until they've lost the battle. And Henry V is victorious at the Battle of Agincourt 600 years ago. But these two things happened during the course of the battle: the French killing the boys and the English killing the prisoners. Now, that's important because they're both violations of the law of arms, of the combat rules and regulations. And what happens is 200 years later, in 1600, William Shakespeare writes a play called Henry V. And in the play, he's doing from obviously the English point of view, talking about an English hero. He talks about the Battle of Agincourt. But even in the play, he has both things. He puts in there the killing of the boys and the killing of the prisoners. That's written into the play as they're talking about this famous battle. Now, what's interesting about that is, much later, recently, 1989, we now have a movie based on the play, based on the actual battle, right? So this is a contemporary Kenneth Branagh movie where he writes the screenplay about a play that's 400 years old, about a battle that's 600 years old. But Henry V in the movie, Kenneth Branagh is writing a screenplay to make him the hero. And he says in interviews later, he says, look, Shakespeare had 4 hours with his play to really get into the psyche of Henry V and talk about the complexities of it. He goes, man, I don't have that kind of time. I got 90 minutes and I'm trying to tell a story. And so what he does is he leaves in the killing of the boys, which makes the French look really bad, but doesn't put in the killing of the prisoners, which would make Henry look bad. He just left that part out, an interesting editorial choice. But he said, look, I'm editing down the story, and my story is about Henry, and Henry's the hero and he's the good guy. So I left that part out. Now, it turns out it's an important piece, though, both piece, the killing of the boys and the killing of the prisoners, because there's already, the point is that even 600 years ago, there's already customary rules and principles at play, and they're seen as violations of them. And so that's a setup that gets us from the battle to the play to another battle. Again, these are true stories. These are actual battles. This is the Battle of Solferino. This is in 1859. And it turns out that this battle, which is in northern Italy, is famous because this person, Jean Henry Dunant, he actually comes to the battle not as a general, not as a soldier. He's actually a businessman from Switzerland, and he's trying to reach Napoleon III, who's the leader of the French troops. They're fighting the Austro-Hungarians in Solferino. But Henry Dunant's essentially got a business proposition for Napoleon. He wants to find him to talk business. But what happens is he arrives at Solferino just as the battle is ending. And it's just a massacre. And he shows up and he's overwhelmed by what he finds. And it turns out there's a short video called The Story of an Idea that I'll put into the playlist on the YouTube channel, which tells this whole story. But he shows up at the battlefield and there's all these wounded soldiers and there's lots of confusion. Again, it's 1859. The sick, the injured, the wounded, they're all over the place. It's a train wreck. And even both sides are just trying to pull back, reorganize, regroup, count their dead, treat and bind the wounded, but they're just overwhelmed by the numbers. And so what Dunant does is he says, look, I need to forget about my business for a minute and just help. This is a humanitarian crisis. This needs my immediate attention. So he goes into the town of Solferino and he says, look, can I bring some of these wounded soldiers into the church and make it a makeshift hospital? And the people there say, yeah. So they begin to help them. And they begin to bring in wounded soldiers from both sides, which is an important piece here. The battle's over. They're just worried about helping the sick, the wounded, the people that have been injured in this battle. So they bring them into this church and they set up and they begin to help care for them. And then over the next few days and weeks, they treat them. They even write their families for them. And it's just purely done out of a sense of humanitarian values, led by Dunant, supported by the people of the town of Solferino. And after a few weeks, when things they have died down, they've patched people up, they've sent them home, they've got them reunited with their armies and their families. what happens is he goes back. That's Dunant there on the left. He writes about it. He writes a book about the battle and about what happened afterwards, about how the townspeople came together to treat these wounded folks. And he gets this idea, writing the book and talking about his experience. He says we need to found a core of volunteers who won't be part of the armies. They won't be part of the diplomats trying to solve and stop the battle. They will just be humanitarian helpers, completely neutral, no dog in the fight, just there to help. And it turns out that this idea gets a lot of traction very quickly, and they begin the International Committee of the Red Cross. That committee then says, look, we've had this oral tradition, this custom for a long time. We need to write this down. We need to put pen to paper and come up with a list of rules that will apply during armed combat of things you can and can't do. What's a legitimate target? What's not? What protections can we give non-combatants? And that's the beginning of the first Geneva Convention. And it turns out that the committee, the Red Cross, from the very beginning, as sponsors of this first convention, become the guardians of IHL, of international humanitarian law, that protects wounded and sick soldiers and prisoners of war, and importantly, civilians, non-combatants. And slowly over time, they get all the countries of the world to agree to sign and participate in this framework of humanitarian values. So it turns out for their efforts, the very first ever Nobel Peace Prize goes to Dunant personally. And then also the committee, the organization he founded with others, is recognized for their work in 1917, 1944, 1963. And so they've been doing important work, certainly throughout the 20th century, but have had a huge important role in terms of how do we handle ourselves, how do we express humanitarian values, even in times of war. Now, the Red Cross does a lot of education. The American Red Cross, there's a Red Cross organization in each of the countries which has signed the conventions. So there's an American Red Cross, just like there's a Mexican Red Cross and a Costa Rican Red Cross and a Haitian Red Cross. There's one in every country around the world. And they have different strengths and weaknesses. There's also a federation which governs them, coordinates their efforts, and also helps to continue to have IHL evolve over time. We've been talking about child soldiers with Calvin Graham, and looking at some of the videos that I dropped into the playlist. These ideas continue to evolve over time as technology changes, as values change. And sadly, there's still a need for the Red Cross to be involved in IHL and to continue to do the work of trying to reach out and protect civilians and guard combatants, especially those who have been taken as prisoners or wounded on the battlefield. Now, they do a lot of work, academic work, but a lot of work in the field. I had a chance to go, I mentioned to go to Geneva and study the conventions there at the headquarters. But it's also important to know, these are St. Philip's College students, that there is and Professor Fuller, these are actually, the American Red Cross is part of this giant international network, but it also calls us to participate in local activities, the San Antonio chapter of the American Red Cross is a large, active, busy chapter that does everything from, I think this day they were out doing installations of smoke alarms in homes. They have a program to help do that because they do disaster prevention as well as disaster relief and first aid. And so there's an active chapter here in San Antonio, just like there are in cities across the US and again in all these countries around the world. So it's a large, complex organization doing a lot of different things, from IHL right down to, like I said, smoke alarms inside San Antonio homes. Now, one of the things that we try to do is that we actually have an obligation under the Geneva Conventions to teach about these rules to all the members of the military. So there's required training on the Geneva Conventions for every member of the armed forces, and also for civilians. We're also called to integrate this curriculum into our classrooms and our education at K through 12, higher education at every level, and to make sure that we're talking about it and teaching it through programs like Exploring Humanitarian Law. So part of us talking about this as a case study is fulfilling our legal obligations under the Geneva Conventions to talk to students about these humanitarian principles. And for us, it fits right into this larger conversation about, well, are the rules and principles that govern combat, are they reflections of just cultural values like Henry Dunant's Swiss values? Are there rules and principles, though, that somehow supersede that and are somehow moral obligations on all people everywhere, from kind of this, moral law, natural law perspective, an objectivist perspective that says, no, things like the killing of the boys was wrong 600 years ago, and it's wrong today. That's a thing that's an approach which says that it's always been wrong, and now the laws just reflect that. That was wrong before, and now we write it down, as opposed to saying, well, no, it's wrong because we wrote it down and all agreed to it. That's a different kind of approach. Now, like I said, we're doing this all around the world. The Exploring Humanitarian Law program, there's links to that in the modules if you want to learn more about this. The materials that you need for Thursday nights are just within the modules. You just need to understand the basics of what it is and how it works. So if you're interested, there's a lot more available for you to pursue. If you're not, you just need what's in the module for the class. But I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to see that, to learn a little bit about the history, about IHL, about the Exploring Humanitarian Law program from the ICRC. And if you do have an interest, you can pursue the links through the Exploring Humanitarian Law program, through the videos, through the Story of an Idea, which is put out by the ICRC, the video about Henry Dunant. So there's lots to learn if you're interested. But again, it's valuable to us, especially as we're looking at this distinction between objectivism and relativism, between consequentialism or deontology. That helps us get at, well, what are the roots of IHL? What's the foundation of it? Where's the theological and philosophical foundation of the rule that says you can't kill civilians, you can't bomb hospitals, you have to feed and clothe and treat well your prisoners? Those are rules, and everybody agrees to them now. And we go to great lengths to to live up to our international obligations and our moral obligations under IHL. So think about all of that as you're kicking around the idea of Baha Musa. That I intentionally used a case involving the British Expeditionary Forces in Iraq. It gives us a little distance from it, but again, God knows we've got a dog in that fight, as they say. We have our own shared experiences of both straining and violating the IHL laws there. But let's stay focused on the doctor, on the case, and on Baha Musa, and bring some of this to bear on that particular case study. So let me wrap it up there for tonight. If you've got questions, let me know, and we'll talk a little bit more about the philosophy tomorrow as we get inching our way up towards Thursday night in the midnight deadline. All right. Take care. As always, it's been a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.